growing economic crisis and a logistical failing. It's certainly looking like it's going to be an interesting Christmas and then New Year. Before COVID, it had been clear that there were some serious problems with the globalized markets that had been powering on for decades with minimal disruption. Now, with the COVID pandemic and lockdowns that have come with it, it has become clear that they were much more fragile than we were being led to believe. Now, an economic crisis alone would be quite the situation to handle, especially with President Biden in office at the current moment and his seemingly dedicated position on making the American economy, and by extension, the global economy, worse in every way possible. But the logistical crisis is much more concerning. An economic one, surely, is something to be worried about, especially for those with retirements and, well, their jobs on the line. But a logistical crisis is one step further. Instead of just having your savings wiped out by the Fed's latest policy, you're going to be having the scene where the shops are going to be empty. Essential goods and products aren't going to be available to purchase, even if your job has been maintained throughout the government policies. It's looking pretty grim. And the actual picture of what's going on is even harder to find. When you look at the mainstream media, you'll get little snippets of something horrible happening. Perhaps they're talking about the ships in California and the disruptions that is going on there, the massive tailback of ships. Perhaps you'll hear about Christmas and maybe some gifts will not be available. Or they could mention some of the issues with the agriculture sector and meat processing along those lines, labour shortages and the works. But they're not going to be talking about all these issues together because it paints an incredibly concerning picture beyond something that we've recently seen. It's looking grim, and we have to find out the answer. You're listening to Cascading Failure. Now, the first thing we're going to talk about is railways, and they have sort of a special place in your heart. I'm sure that when we were all kids growing up, there was a certain element of us that loved to see steam trains and anything train related. It's, I guess, a cultural trend. But in the real world, in recent memory, trains have always been a steady source of problems, and railways in the Western world in general have been a source of problem. Now, in the UK, this is a bit different, but I would say that's more due to a massive government subsidy than being different from the trend. In the United States and elsewhere, railways have increasingly been justifying their existence in the modern world, with its green potential being the recent source for funding. Now, I like trains as much as anyone, perhaps a bit more. It's incredible to see how they once worked and possibly their potential if used properly. Freight in the United States is actually one of the most economical uses of railways in the world. Very low subsidies to non-existent subsidies, and a privatization of the sector has meant that it's achieving things beyond its European counterparts or even elsewhere around the globe. And that's a very important thing to note. Freight is the primary way that railways are being used in America, and they're still heavily used, even with the interstate highways and the power of modern trucking. But there is a growing issue, and this is in the Pacific Northwest. There is a container shortage for the railways, and there is also a train shortage for the railways in the Northwest. Now, I would imagine that there are also disruptions along the West Coast in general and elsewhere. It appears that the trains cannot run with the lockdown restrictions that have been imposed upon them and the general surge of demand that has been seen across the economy. If the freight network collapses entirely, we could see this problem being unable to be dealt with the other logistical crisis at the moment, trucking. Across the Western world, we're seeing serious issues around trucking that has really started in the pandemic and has only grown. Each country has their own unique, take on it. For Australia, we have recently had a series of trucking protests around the government's quarantine and testing regime, along with the vaccine regime. In the United States, there's also been protests along those grounds, and in Europe as well. In the United States, however, there is just a shortage of workers who are willing to do the job now. And that could be down to many different factors. Some of that could be the, peaceful protests that tore through the United States. There may be a general unwillingness now to, operate within certain parts of the country. But even if there is no problems, the demand is just immense. With the government kind of just throwing out money, people are using it to buy whatever they want, and, that has to get to them somehow. But there's also been a surge of demand with firms suddenly opening up across the country as the pandemic restrictions are either ignored or are lifted. And, that's not good for a supply chain, a sudden surge after uncertain demand in the future. But there is one investigation that we just did, and that was around western ports of the United States of America and North America by extension. And it was truly stunning to see what the situation in these western ports are. Now, western ports have become critical for the modern American economy, with most of the industrial base moving to China and all the joys that has brought. But that means now that for essential goods, we're now relying on China. And America is no exception to this. In fact, America has embraced head-on supplying vital elements from China. And that means that the western ports of the United States are now one of the busiest in the world. Especially the port of Los Angeles, which has that massive tailback that's being covered in the news. But I'm going to go through the rest of the ports to show it isn't an isolated, just Californian problem, as much as we may hope it was just isolated to California. Now, the first port that I'm going to mention is actually two ports. They're both joined together in something called the Northwest Seaport Alliance. That's the port of Seattle and Tacoma. And according to an interview with Dick Mazzino, the port commissioner and co-chair of Northwest Seaport Alliance, both ports are stuck with congestion that they've not normally seen. And the evidence of this not being normal has been that emergency harbours have been activated. And Mr. Mazzino believed that the congestion would continue into 2022. And that pairs with the lack of rail cars that I mentioned earlier. So we have a demand that has grown by 38.4% compared to the year before. Now, researching what's actually happening in these ports was actually quite difficult because you'd be surprised to know that the port has recently announced a large amount of construction work, and it hasn't made more than one announcement about its climate policies. You'd love to see them. The climate emergency is being dealt with, and we don't really need to issue a statement on the logistical emergency that is facing Americans. And despite some sources claiming that the area has not been impacted, it's just false. The Coast Guard has had to issue new guidance for these emergency harbours that have been activated, and there's just no grounding for the claim that it's only California. No, it has spread all the way up to Seattle. But looking into Canada, the northern neighbour of the United States, we see a very odd story. Now, the Port of Vancouver and the Port of Prince Rupert have seen a strange demand. While the western United States ports have just seen a steady increase of demand, the Port of Vancouver has seen an increase, but has managed to cope with this. Now, this could be because it doesn't have the facilities to handle the type of cargo that's coming into the United States of America. That's probably the most likely outcome. Or it could just be it had a large amount of extra resources ready to go. It's not certain for me. Once again, though, the rail car disruption and the railway disruption has hit Vancouver especially hard. Now, the Port of Prince Rupert, it looks like it's doing amazing. It's actually seen a drop in the amount of demand that's hit the port, and it has opened up a new terminal, from what I can gather. But if you look at the primary harbour of Prince Rupert, it's been overwhelmed. It's had a large increase. So someone more, focused on Canada can sort of clue us all in with that one. I would say these ports are uniquely focused on exporting, not necessarily importing. So you can't, even if you wanted to, route a ship into them. That is not designed to deal with the heavy cargo ships. There's probably other ports along the west coast, but American ports are really kind of focused in on the wider supply chain. So the Port of Los Angeles, which is the well-known one, and it's the primary way you get goods into the United States. You then have the Northwest Alliance Seaport, which handles Alaskan shipping and handles just some container shipping as well. And these are really big areas that are focused upon. You don't see like a lot of small ports that are handling all this demand. And it means that in a time of crisis, we really don't have the processing ability anymore. Now, labor shortages is one thing that has been kind of floated around about what's actually happened here. But I think something's more seriously wrong here. We have disruptions on the road, the rail, and the port itself. And we have the disruption going all the way out to sea. Once again, President Biden, he doesn't think this is a problem. Not a problem at all. I guess the climate really should get his focus on this ground. With these problems hitting our society, we are more vulnerable than what we were previously due to the choices that the general population has adopted along with the culture. A large amount of people no longer grow any food for themselves or have any knowledge or really ability to do that quickly. And they're disconnected from the wider community, which means when disruptions happen, when they can't get goods, there isn't going to be that sense of community pulling together that we saw in other crises. On an individual basis, we all have to decide if we want to get prepared for what happens next. We all have to work out if we want to build up our own skills, and that matter. But ideally moving to a place or joining in with your community is the best bet. That's just good for your health in a general sense. Our reliance on globalized connected systems should be viewed as dangerous as it actually is. The promise that these systems can't break is a lie, like so many other promises made with a globalized connected system. And it's up to us now to deal with the consequences of this lie as the truth starts to unravel. So, thank you for listening. I hope that you enjoyed it. Now, there's going to be a bit of a period of experimentation with the channel in the video style. I've found that the stock footage and blending that all together, it can be quite nice for everyone to watch and everything like that, but it takes an immense amount of time. So I'm going to be trialing less footage unless it's necessary. So in the last video, I've included some President Obama's and all that speech about Iraq and Afghanistan. The hope is that with less of those special visual effects, more content can come out and the focus can be on the actual what is being produced here and not necessarily the flashy visuals. But it's going to be a process. I may go back to the visuals. It really just comes down to what works best.